You're listening to episode 119 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Shinzen joins us to speak about meditation, pain relief, and science. We encounter this practice in so many ways, often through suffering, sometimes through disciplines like the martial arts, or from an interest in fixing some issues we've had with concentration. And sometimes we come to it through a fascination with a culture that holds more interest to us than the one into which we've been born. However we get here, it's what we do with this teaching that allows it to truly come to fruition. That path may be particularly religious, or not. It may even be a fairly secular approach, but taking new expression within the context of a traditional framework. Things are not always as they seem. We should continue to question, and we should consider that our first impressions may not always prove to be quite as constrained as our minds may be. Shinzen became fascinated with Asian culture while a teenager in Los Angeles. Later, he enrolled in a PhD program in Buddhist studies at the University of Wisconsin. Eventually, he went to Asia and did extensive training in each of the three major Buddhist traditions, Vajrayana, Zen, and Vipassana. Upon returning to the United States, his academic interests shifted to the burgeoning dialogue between Eastern meditation and Western science. Shinzen is known for his innovative, interactive, algorithmic approach to mindfulness, a system specifically designed for use in pain management, recovery support, and as an adjunct to psychotherapy. He leads meditation retreats throughout North America and has helped establish numerous mindfulness centers and programs. He also consults widely on meditation-related research, both in the clinical and the basic science domains. Special thanks to Emily Barrett from the Home Practice Program for her help in coordinating today's interview. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice vanilla frappuccino. And our guest today is Shinzen Young. Shinzen, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure, Ted.
I'm very eager to speak with you because I've had many listeners of the podcast reach out to me and suggest you as someone that will be a very good person to have on a secular Buddhist podcast. Let's start by asking about your background and how you first encountered as a Westerner meditative practice.
Well, I was born in L.A. My family of origin is Russian Jewish. And actually, we were pretty connected to our synagogue. My mother was the executive secretary, and I had a very charismatic and knowledgeable rabbi. So I think there was some influence there as a role model for, someone whose profession is to help people by making things clear. My best friend in what in those days was called junior high, which is now called middle school. Oh yeah, in 15 months I will be 70 years old.
Congratulations!
So, yeah,
it's a milestone.
So, anyway, back in the day, in junior high. My best friend was third generation Japanese American. And so one day he invited me to go with his family to see Japanese movies. Now, I had not the slightest interest in Japan whatsoever. In fact, I didn't like Japan. I mean, I liked my friend and his family, but they were Americans. I didn't like the country of Japan because World War II, I was born in the last year of World War II. That was an enemy country, bad guys. So I had no interest in seeing a Japanese movie, but it was their family, and I didn't want to be offensive, so okay, I'll tag along. I was 14 years old. So it was a double bill. The first movie was in contemporary Japan. It was a love story, and I was bored.
As a young man would be in any love story movie.
Yes. And the second one, however, was set in 16th century Japan, and it was a period piece samurai movie with martial arts.
Was it a Kurosawa film?
Oh, no, this is not this. Kurosawa is A+. This is a B-. Like a poor Western, they call it a shoot 'em up.
Yeah.
Well, these are hack 'em ups. They're called chambara in Japanese, which is an onomatopoetic word. You can sort of hear it's like chambara, right? It's like slash and cut and yell, right, and whatever. But at the age of 14, seeing pre-modern Japan, a culture with essentially no Western influence. Actually there was, but at that time, but it didn't appear in the movie at all. So this was an extraterrestrial culture. Obviously they were human beings, but the way that they wore their hair, the way they dressed, their body language, the way they used spoken language, the attitudes, the way they fought. I had never seen humans like this, and I was mesmerized, just mesmerized. I guess a traditional Buddhist would say, well, I was remembering a former life. Not that I believe in that necessarily, but I can sort of see why people might believe in that.
Of course, it's very compelling.
Like out of nowhere, I was suddenly hooked, like instantly hooked. I wanted to know everything about that world. So my friend's parents could sort of speak Japanese. They were what's called Nisei, second generation Japanese American. So I pummeled them with questions. What did that word mean, and why did that guy cut his belly open without even hesitating? And so, whoa, what's going on here? And so they started to teach me the rudiments of the Japanese language, and I started to go every week. And then we go to Little Tokyo area of LA. So this was a big, and we'd have Japanese food afterwards. They taught me how to order, how to eat with chopsticks. This was an esoteric adventure for a white boy in the early 50s. There were no non-Asians there. You go to Chinatown, that's one thing, okay? But J-Town, that was terra incognita. And I was like the only, I was doing something no one was doing. And eventually I found out there's a whole Japanese American language or school system that meets after American public school and on Saturdays and runs parallel. So I decided to go to Japanese school because something told me that the secret was the language. If I wanted to know this culture, I would have to master the language. So by the time I graduated from Venice High in Los Angeles, I also simultaneously graduated from Sawtelle Japanese Language Institute, and I had been privileged to grow up bilingual and bicultural in Los Angeles. So
and with a culture that was not your own, it's one you had adopted.
Yeah, and
started
my parents,
with an aversion to.
Yeah, my parents thought it was terrific. They were very much in favor because it was a big intellectual challenge to master an esoteric language. I realized, though, that I'd never really be able to understand Japan unless I understood the Chinese cultural background. So while still in high school, my parents dutifully found me a Mandarin Chinese tutor so I could also learn Chinese. And then I realized that I could never really understand China unless I understood Buddhism. And for that, I would have to learn the classical language of India, which is Sanskrit. So my parents dutifully got me a Sanskrit tutor while I was still in high school. So I had this early fortune to be exposed to Asian languages. So that led to my being an Asian language major at UCLA, and that led to my being a Buddhist studies major in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin. And that led to my going to Japan in order to academically study Buddhism at Mount Koya, which is the headquarters for Japanese Vajrayana, which is known as Shingon. But when I got there in, would have been around 1969, something like that, I got there and I was going to do research on Japanese esoteric Buddhism, Japanese Vajrayana. And despite all my language abilities and letters of recommendation and background, they wouldn't teach me anything because they said, well, this is not just something for you to adorn your ego with academically. This is a practice to transform who you are. And if you are willing to do the practice, well, we'll maybe teach you the practice, but you have to become a Buddhist monk. So I did. In 1970, I was ordained in the Shingon school, and that's where I got the name Shinzen. The Shin is the Shin of Shingon. The Zen is a different character than Zen Buddhism, though. A lot of people think my name has something to do with Zen Buddhism. It's a different Chinese character. So my initial training was in Japanese Vajrayana, which is, in terms of Tibetan Vajrayana, it is the three lower tantras. There's 4 divisions of tantras. It's one of the ways that it's described in Tibet. There's actually many ways to classify the tantric text, but one of the standard ones is 4 divisions. And in terms of that classification, Shingon practice is the lower 3 tantras. So it is related to things done in Tibet. So I did that on Mount Koya for 3 years. But during that period of time, I also spent some time at Shokokuji Zen Temple because I was also interested in Zen practice. And so what also happened during that period of time was that I met at a Zen retreat a Roman Catholic priest named Father William Johnston. Now, I grew up Jewish, and I had never talked in my entire life to a priest. I mean, my grandmother, if she saw a Catholic priest, she would spit, not out of contempt, but out of superstition to ward off the evil eye, because they were afraid of priests. So I never talked to one, and I met this guy at this retreat, and I thought it was like, wow, Irish Catholic priest doing at a Japanese Zen retreat. Then I discovered that, in fact, it was quite common for Jesuits, particularly, to get involved in Buddhist practice and to be in dialogue with Buddhists, and to adopt Buddhist meditation techniques for the purpose of reinvigorating the Christian contemplative tradition. Well, I didn't even know that there was a contemplative tradition in Christianity. I didn't know that there were meditative experiences outside of Buddhism. Meeting Father Johnston vastly increased my the scope of my interest, because I came to understand that the kinds of things that we experience in Buddhist practice have actually been experienced by other people in Christianity, Islam, and in Judaism. There was and is a whole Jewish meditation tradition that has some amazing overlaps with some formulations of Buddhism. So Father Johnston got me to see my Buddhist experiences within the larger framework of world contemplative technologies. And then just before I left Japan, he showed me this article, which was about scientists who were studying meditative states. And he was all excited because he was a Jesuit, he was an intellectual, and it's like, look, the scientists are confirming some of the things that Christian and Buddhist contemplatives are reporting, and he was all excited. And that gave me this thought. I started my life, I wanted to become Japanese. I wanted to be, and I was actually well on my way to becoming a big-nosed, light-skinned Japanese person. I mean, I was racially different, but linguistically, culturally, if I'd stayed in Japan, I would have become a Japanese person, culturally and personality-wise and whatever. I was on that course. But it occurred to me that in learning how to meditate in Japanese Buddhist monasteries, I had learned something that was bigger than Japanese culture, much more important than Japanese culture, something that was of universal importance for all of humanity. And then I looked out and I asked myself, do I see, it's like, I guess the metaphor I would use is, when I was a little kid, I saw this mountain called Asia, and I wanted to climb this mountain. And I achieved that. I became a Japanese Buddhist monk, accepted as a Japanese Buddhist monk in Japan, even though I was racially something else. So I sort of reached the pinnacle of that mountain, and I'm looking out and I'm saying, do I see another mountain that is equally impressive? And I did. Western science. That's universal and very powerful. So the seed was planted in me that, okay, I know I'm going to meditate the rest of my life. Maybe someday this cross-fertilization of science and Buddhist practice, maybe that'll gain some traction in the world. I mean, when Johnston showed me this article, this was a long, long time ago. That's before Mind and Life, before the Dalai Lama was meeting with Nobel laureates. I mean, this is decades before that, right? But the thought occurred to me, well, I know someday I'm going to be a 20-year, 30-year, 40-year, 50-year meditation veteran. It would be good if I knew enough about science to intelligently dialogue with science. So I thought, okay, I'll just meditate, and on the side, I'm going to learn the hard sciences. I'm going to learn math. I'm going to go all the way up to advanced calculus, whatever I need. I'm going to learn physics, all the different chemistry, biochemistry, molecular biology. I'm going to learn all that stuff on the side, so that maybe someday I can participate in what would be the most important thing that could happen, which would be the best of the East fertilizing with the best of the West. So that it turned out that it worked out that way, as we now see. So the summary of my life is that I am a Jewish Buddhist who was turned on to science by a Roman Catholic priest.
And that is a wonderful story, and particularly I like the metaphor that you have of you saw a mountain, the Japanese cultural mountain, and you climbed that, and from that vantage point you saw another mountain of science. Something that this led me to ask, I often get questioned by my more aggressively atheist brethren about why I participate in interfaith dialogues on a regular basis. I'm the Buddhist panelist on a regular conversation that occurs. You yourself have studied several of the main branches of the Buddhist tree, coming from a different a Jewish cultural background, and you've really adopted a different way of living and really integrated that into your life. What is the most fascinating to you about these approaches? Because you made reference to something that comes up quite frequently in interfaith dialogues, that these practices, whether it's a traditional background or the cultural background, point to things that are human experiences. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, exactly that. It's clear to me. Well, let's just put it this way. There's two kinds of people. There's lumpers and there's splitters. Okay? It's a tendency. Lumpers tend to see similarities. Splitters tend to get into the details of differences. Now, there's something to be said for both perspectives, because it's a dialectical process between those two ways of looking at things. However, if I look broadly at worldwide contemplative experience, it seems to me that, broadly speaking, it's one thing. Yes, there are a lot of local details that you could say, well, this one said it was this way and this one said it was this way. But based on my own personal experience and years of teaching and years of talking to people from all sorts of traditions, around the world there is a sort of central contemplative theme. And I have a certain way of conceptualizing that, which we may or may not want to go into. But so I tend to see the similarities. And the way I teach meditation is that I say, okay, I'm going to give you certain exercises that are attentional exercises. They are going to develop within you three very useful attentional skills. They're going to elevate your base level of three attentional skills. We'll call one of these skills concentration power, which will say you can think of as the ability to focus on what you deem relevant at any given moment. And another skill that we're going to teach you is sensory clarity, which you can think about as the ability to untangle the strands of your sensory experience. And then we're going to teach you yet a third skill called equanimity, which you can think of as the ability to allow sensory experience to come and go without push and pull. Now, you can analyze all of the world's contemplative traditions in terms of the ways in which they describe and utilize these three skills. And then I tell people, okay, we're going to develop these skills to a very high degree of strength, and then we're going to apply them in 5 areas. Reduction of your suffering, elevation of your fulfillment, understanding of who you are, not just at a psychological level, but at the deepest possible level, which most people would describe as a spiritual level. We're also going to use them for cultivating positive habits. And by the way, the word Shila, often translated as a precept, actually means more like character or habit or mode of being. So we're going to develop, we're going to use these skills to foster certain positive character or behavioral habits with regards to having more positive emotion, having more rational cognition or appropriate cognition, and also actual change of behaviors in terms of letting go of bad habits or cultivating more desirable habits. So we're going to use these skills not just to reduce your suffering, elevate your fulfillment, and give you self-insight, but also to actually change your habits to more positive affect, more positive objective behaviors, and more appropriate cognitions. Those are the ABCs of Shila, being a good human being. And then finally, the result of all of the above at some point will probably be a spontaneous spirit of love and service, which will come about as the result of the first 3 things I mentioned, and that is what in the Mahayana tradition is called bodhicitta. And so then I say, this is all we're going to teach you. This is all I'm going to teach you. How you philosophically formulate what you experience is up to you. I am going to give you some hardware, and you can run any software you want. When you experience who you really are at the deepest level, if you want to call that no self, you can. If you want to call that the true witness, the true self, you can. If you want to call that emptiness, you can. And if you want to call that God, that is perfectly fine with me.
It seems that this approach is less focused on the more traditional aspects of any particular religious or philosophical background one may have. And to me, I see that as having a particularly wonderful advantage. Have you found that the case when you're teaching to a contemporary or typically Western audience?
Well, it's perfect because one size fits all. I give you the hardware, and I want you to develop that hardware to an industrial level. I also want you to apply it in broad areas, okay? I do have that, there is that amount of concept, okay? You should have reduced suffering due to physical and emotional distress. You should have elevated fulfillment. You should understand the surface of how you work, which is your individual personality. You should understand the sensory systems that create the sense of self. And then as you see more deeply, you'll see something that you will likely refer to as the source of those sensory experiences. What you call that source, how you formulate it, I don't care. But I do want you to look that deeply, et cetera, et cetera. So this way, if you're a skeptical humanist, a Marxist, there's nothing in this practice that asks you to accept anything other than skeptical materialism. But if you're a Roman Catholic or an Orthodox Jew, you can do it too.
And in fact, that was part of the conversation we had before starting the interview, is this definition of what we mean by a secular Buddhist practice. And as we use the word Buddhist, I mean that as the practice itself. What is it that's a human thing that we can all do, regardless of our religious or non-religious views and attitudes and approaches? Shinzen, how would you define this secular, traditional discussion that we typically view as a dichotomy? Tell us more about your thoughts on that.
Well, I would start with experience rather than concepts. And I would start actually with the skills that you're going to need in order to have experience. So I would claim that the three skills that I just mentioned, which can be operationalized, they can be defined, probably be defined to the satisfaction of science at a biophysical level, okay? Well, a lot is known about attention or concentration. There's been a lot of research on the underlying biophysics, neurophysiology of concentration or focus. The sensory clarity piece, you can do T-scope studies to show increase in temporal resolution. You can do two-point touch sensitivity to show increase in spatial resolution. There's different things that you can do that will show how people have developed qualitative temporal and spatial increase in their sensory clarity. And then equanimity is probably, don't know for sure, but probably related to something that Richie Davidson calls stickiness, and that stickiness is, of course, that's the reciprocal of equanimity, right? So equanimity is the non-stickiness, and the stickiness is, there are ways that we're now trying to look at the neurophysiology of that. So the skills that I'm describing are things that probably can be operationalized by the canons of very materialistic science. Yet we know that these skills change a person's relation to their ordinary sensory experience, to where their ordinary sensory experience becomes utterly extraordinary. And so my approach is, don't try to convince people of anything, really, other than the rather modest claims that these three skills can help with those 5 tasks. And I can give, in chemistry, the name of the game is something called the reaction mechanism. You can look up arrow pushing on the Wikipedia, and you'll see what it's all about. Okay, that's what you learn in organic chemistry, and that's the basis of biochemistry, molecular biology, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, what's the explanatory mechanism? Well, I can connect the dots, and have on the internet, and at Harvard Medical School, and whatever, to very skeptical audiences. I can connect the dots. How do these skills lead to these effects? So there's nothing mystical schmystical here so far, okay? So my approach is equip people with skills, then show them how to apply those skills to the themes that I just mentioned. And those skills are only a relationship to sensory experience. No other claims are made here. I don't claim to know objective truth.
Right.
But I do claim to know some things that are true, useful, and not necessarily obvious, and therefore deep, about the nature of sensory experience. So give people the microscope, the awareness extending tool. There's a price. They have to practice the techniques regularly. Show them how to apply it to their sensory, to the themes that I just mentioned, which is essentially applying it to their sensory experience. And then they'll start to see things for themselves. And it's a Socratic approach. And then let them get the like the Buddha said, ehi passiko, come see for yourself.
I was just about to say that the phrase ehi passiko is come and see, not come and believe.
Even though the Buddha said ehi passiko, in fact, the great majority of what the Buddhist tradition does is try to convince people of a certain perspective before anything. It starts out with sammaditthi, the right point of view. And that but that is a lifetime right there. Okay? And so you can argue about the right point of view among the three vehicles and Madhyamika versus Yogacara, and it could just go on and on and on. I don't, personally, that's not where I want to start. I want to start with the skills, the attentional skills, that will let people look at their own experience.
Now, what can we show rather than having conversations that amount to how many angels dance on the head of a pin? So you'd mentioned a moment ago Richie Davidson, and I just wanted to mention to people who are listening to the podcast that that concept of stickiness is also brought up in Richie's new book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, how its unique patterns affect the way you think, feel, and live, and how you can change them. I also wanted to mention that in a recent presentation at a conference on the science of meditation, Richie gave a talk, and one of the challenges that he put down for scientists, for researchers investigating this, is that there needs to be a greater degree of taking their tests with a skeptical mind and having greater controls of them, because that's been one of the criticisms that's happened. He mentioned several different metadata analyses of, in particular, MBSR criticisms. And what I'm hoping that people will do is take that next step in the rigor that we put around the science of this, because we can do that. That is also a skill that we need to develop. Now, Shinzen, you yourself have made a study of that intersection of contemplative practice and scientific research into the nature of consciousness. Tell us a little bit about that and what you've found. It's a big one, I know.
Well, I mean, the little imp inside me says, what I've mostly found is it is damn hard to do good science in this area. It is really hard. However, I also believe that good science eventually will be done in this area. But like Richie says, we're not there yet, okay? It is really, really hard. I have this presentation that's on the internet. I gave it at as the keynote, actually, to the first Buddhist Geeks conference. I called it Towards the Science of Enlightenment. It's a PowerPoint presentation where I sort of outlined this whole vision visually. And towards the end, I have a picture of Galileo demonstrating his little crude telescope to the Doge of Venice, the mayor of the city of Venice. And then next, juxtaposed with that, and so they're looking through this telescope, right? This like 16th century telescope. And juxtaposed to that, I have the Hubble telescope, and it's sort of like cute because it's like they're looking at the Hubble And so compare, okay, so the technology of Galileo, his telescope, they knew that they were onto something, okay? They knew they were onto something. They're looking at the moon. Aristotle and the Catholic Church says the moon is perfectly spherical, and they can see it's all pockmarked, okay? So they knew that there was a brave new world out there to discover. But if you think of the difference in the technology, the 400 years later technology that can, what the Hubble can do, okay, it can look to the origin of the universe compared to looking at the moon, okay? So right now, we're in on the ground floor. We're like Galileo. We have these relatively crude ways, even though the crude way might be a $3 million fMRI machine, okay?
Right.
With another $2 million for the suite and the staff, okay? But yet, that is actually a Galilean telescope in terms of the temporal and spatial resolution that we need in order to really start to get a science of enlightenment. However, we know, criticisms notwithstanding that I just mentioned and you just mentioned, okay, we've seen enough to know that, yeah, there's something here and it's damn important. But we don't yet have the Hubble telescope. But we know that there will be. But unless there is a catastrophic collapse of all human civilization, which I think is sort of unlikely in the next 50 years, a loss of all technology, etc., okay, barring that black swan event, by the end of the century, we should have that Hubble. And I think there will come from that a true science of, not just a science of meditation, but a true scientific paradigm of what happens in classical enlightenment. And then based on that can come a technology that can accelerate the process so that it can spread virally to everyone who's ready for it on the planet.
Let's take a segue over to some of the things that you have on your site, and I'll mention this again at the end for folks who are listening. But the website we'll be talking about is www.basicmindfulness.org, and you do have several CDs: The Science of Enlightenment, Breakthrough Difficult Emotions, and Meditation: A Beginner's Guide to Start Meditating. I want to talk about your books, though. A particular one I want to focus on is it's a re-release of your Breakthrough Pain from 2005 that's been re-released as Natural Pain Relief. Tell us about that and where your interest in the efficacy of meditation for pain relief came from.
Yes. Well, I think I'm a pretty effective meditation teacher, and I think one of the reasons for that is that I have very little natural ability at meditation. If you, so it's one of these things. If I can do it, then anyone can do it, and I can teach anyone to do it because.
So all of us who are not really inclined towards meditation, listen up. We have the opportunity.
So my mother tells me that I was what mothers call a difficult baby. I was whiny. I was kvetchy. If people know what that idiom means, it's the Jewish word for complaining. I had no ability to deal with any kind of physical discomfort. I ran away from all emotional situations If something was happening with adults around me where they were going through a bereavement or something tragic or whatever, my only strategy was run away. So I didn't like being around people. I was afraid of emotions. I was afraid of any kind of physical discomfort whatsoever. So I arrive in Japan, and it's like, hey, guess what? We're not going to teach you unless you become a monk. So this is Japan. This is old school Japanese monastic training. That means...
comfort is not part of it.
Yeah. What is a monastery? A monastery, actually it's the same east and west. A monastery is a giant feedback device. It's a 24/7 biofeedback device. If you are in what the Christians call a recollected state, or what we would call maybe a mindful state, then the monastery is tolerable and sometimes quite blissful. If you are not able to maintain that state 24/7 to some degree, a monastery is at best uncomfortable and at worst an endless sequence of miseries. That's the way Sasaki Roshi, who's a Zen master that I've studied with for many decades here in the United States, he says, "Kurushimi no renzoku." That means like an endless sequence of miseries. Unless you're unless you're intentionally meditating. So suddenly I go from who I was to this samurai torture chamber.
Getting in touch with the First Noble Truth.
It was not pretty. I could barely get in the full lotus, and it's like, hey, you're going to sit here for an hour without moving in the full lotus. And if your whole body shakes, and if your eyes roll up into your head, and if you lose your mind, and you think you're going to pass out, you're not going to move, or we'll beat you. And I could just go on and on with the war stories, horror stories. Oh, by the way, to listeners who are now completely turned off and freaked out, my whole life is devoted to bringing about the results you get from what I just described when it works without having to go through that. See, my philosophy is stuff like that's going to happen to people anyway. Life is going to happen. Stuff is going to happen. I mean, when my father died of lung cancer, what he went through in that last week was as intense as anything anyone ever put themselves through in the name of some sort of practice, okay? He didn't sleep for a week, slowly suffocated to death, okay? There's nothing in Zen that's more intense than that, okay, or any of these practices. It's going to happen anyway. My strategy is, okay, before life does this to you, I'm going to equip you with some skills so that when life does do this to you, you're going to get MMM, maximum meditation mileage. So, okay, so that's what happened. Okay, I was in this environment and I had to deal with pain, and other kinds of physical discomfort, cold, fatigue, sleepiness. And I gradually learned. I learned strategies. I learned ways to work smart. If you can't be disciplined, be clever. It's one of my mantras. Um, so based on those experiences, I created an algorithm for dealing with physical discomfort. An algorithm in the engineer's sense of that word, meaning a systematic process consisting of a systematic process that loops and branches in various ways in real time, depending on what comes up, and ultimately converges to an answer. So it's a bunch of ways of focusing that can be put into a flow chart that eventually will allow you to have an experience of the pain dissolving into a taste of purification, would be the way I would put it. And so I started to write books and create a computer program also that we're working on now that will implement this algorithm. I can describe the algorithm briefly if you want. Or
please, yes. Yes.
Well, if you think about the pain situation, what's your sensory challenge when you deal with pain? This is the whole thing about mindfulness practice. Mindfulness practice that was discovered by the Buddha, and it's an amazing innovation. It's the notion of divide and conquer, or if that sounds too militaristic, untangle and be free, means exactly the same thing. Divide and conquer is used by computer scientists and doctors and mathematicians and so forth. The basic idea is when you're faced with an inscrutable system in nature, try to figure out what the basic dimensions are. What are the basic atoms, the primes out of which all these complicated things are ultimately constructed. So when you're in physical pain, how many basic sensory dimensions are we dealing with here? Well, I would claim 4. You, of course, have the uncomfortable physical sensation itself. That's one thing, one basic dimension. But then you have your mental and emotional reactions to that. Now, your mental and emotional reactions to that are also sensory experiences. And I would claim that your mental reactions have a visual component, which would be your mental images triggered by the pain. Like when my dad had cancer, he would get these images of some sort of monster was biting him. Well, they don't call, you know what cancer means, right? It means the claw of the crab. It's not for nothing that it's given that name, okay? Well, part of the suffering was this disconcerting visual experience, mental image. And then there's the negative mental talk, the poor me, oh my God, awfulizing. That's an auditory experience of a certain kind of self-talk. Then you've got, in addition to the physical sensations, you've got the emotional sensations in your body. The anger, the fear, the sadness, the shame, the agitation, or combinations thereof. So now we've got 4 independent sensory dimensions here. Mental image, mental talk, emotional body sensations constitute a reactive system, and they're reacting moment by moment to the physical sensation of the pain. So the basic idea here is divide and conquer, untangle and be free. If you can track these so that they merely add together, 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10, you won't suffer so much. But most people can't keep track of them. They haven't been trained in the concentration skill to isolate each strand individually. They haven't been trained in the clarity skill to be able to keep track when all the balls are in the air at once, to know which one is which. And they haven't been trained in the equanimity skills that would allow those experiences to come and go without resistance. So instead of experiencing what's really there, which is 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10, if we take 10 to be maximum activation, just as an arbitrary max, what's really there is 4 times 10. But when they tangle together and when they coagulate, then you get the impression of 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. That's 10 to the 4th power, or 10,000. So when that person is saying, due to pain, that I'm suffering at level 10,000, in fact, if they had perfect mindfulness skills, well, what would happen if they had perfect mindfulness skills? So if they had perfect mindfulness skills, which, okay, admittedly take a while to develop, but let's give the hypothetical, like, maximum mindfulness skills. If you worked for perhaps several decades and you really developed incredible mindfulness skills, what you'd be able to do is, first of all, you would have the clarity skill such that even when all 4 were happening at 10 at the same time, you could keep track of all 4 at once without them tangling together. Secondly, you would have the concentration skill that you could hold just one strand at a time and isolate it. Thirdly, so it goes from 10,000 to 40 by total untangling, right? But then it goes from 40 to 10 by your concentration to ability to hold just one at a time. And then when you bring equanimity to that 10, you discover that actually the actual amount of sensation there is probably a 2, and it's being multiplied by a factor of 5 by resistance. And so now you've gone from a 10,000 to a 2, just by a combination of concentration, clarity, and equanimity skills, without changing the sensory experience at all.
Mm-hmm. And as recent studies have shown, that mindfulness meditation can be, in terms of at least self-reporting, more effective than morphine. So that mathematically it fits into what you're saying. That's what we are seeing in those fMRI scans in recent studies.
This is a perfect example of science. We have empirical evidence. Okay, this reaction takes place. You mix these chemicals, this thing happens. But what's the reaction mechanism? I just gave you an explanation for why it happens, why that skill set leads to that effect.
So let's talk for a bit, as our wrap-up, about an organization that you had started. Tell us about Vipassana Support International.
VSI is the organization that organizes many but not all of my retreats. I actually have several organizations. That's one of them. And that's for residential retreats. If people want to come and do residential retreats, they can learn with me. They can learn about that by going to Shinzen.org. And that's where I list my residential retreats. But what people who are listening to this would probably be more interested in is my home practice program. That's an innovation. One of the problems that we have in terms of a truly modern delivery system for a practice is, well, most people can't leave their families, not even, for a couple days. And most people aren't within travel distance of meditation retreat. And even if they were, they can't afford the time off from work. Or they might, for some reason, feel socially out of place at a meditation retreat. They can't get, or maybe they're disabled, okay? Or their finances are very limited. So these are situations that the Buddhist teacher community talks about a lot. What can we do? Our retreats are expensive. They're not easy for the average person. So I thought, okay, well, is there something we can do that is going to be close enough to a retreat that I put it a different way. Is there something that we can do that will be close to doing a residential retreat in terms of its cumulative impact, but could be done by anyone in the world, regardless of their financial situation, their social situation, their family situation, their work situation, their health situation? Is there some way that we can deliver something close to a retreat? Might not be as good as residential, but essentially would cost almost nothing and would not require people to leave their families or their work at all. And in fact, if you couldn't afford it, would cost nothing. And I came up with this idea of conference call-based monthly mini retreats that people can register on the internet for, where when they register, there's reading materials that are available to them to prepare them conceptually, so that even if they don't have a background in practice, they'll be ready to actually practice. And then they're on a conference call with me or one of my trained facilitators and people from all over the world. And it has all of the features of a retreat, but it's compacted into 4 hours. So there's some guided practice. There's a chance for group discussion. You get a chance to practice on your own. You hang up for a period of time. You practice on your own. During that period of time, you can call and talk to a teacher one-on-one, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the home practice program. And for that, people go to basicmindfulness.org. And I'm very proud of that because people report that even though it's only once a month, because it's so tightly organized, if you keep it up month after month, you start to get the effect of having done a residential retreat.
What I find very exciting about that is it eliminates one of the challenges that we've faced with people going to retreats, which is it's expensive, it's hard to get away, you can't take the time off from work, and many of the programs that are available through more traditional settings and even contemporary Western settings have those limitations. So using a new paradigm for how to encourage the practice and still get people in touch with teachers that can support them in doing that is wonderful, wonderful to hear. So thank you very much for setting that kind of thing up, because that is something we've been talking about trying to do with the Secular Buddhist Association, is have that kind of ongoing support. And again, as we've seen from recent studies on mindfulness and the efficacy in dealing with stress and pain, just a little bit of a regular practice can help sustain and build that ongoing neurological change, this self-directed neuroplasticity that Dan Siegel refers to. So thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you for appreciating that.
Well, our guest today has been Shinzen Young. You can find out more about what he is doing, and particularly about these phone-based retreats and classes, on the website www.basicmindfulness.org. Shinzen, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate your time today.
Totally enjoyed myself.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.